For those of you in the back and just arriving, there is room in the auxiliary room here. You'll see Peter on closed circuit, but there is more standing room in there if you're interested. Let me welcome you tonight. I'm Hugh Nichols from Lewis Clark. The sponsors of this event are the Division of Literature and Language, School of Arts and Sciences, and the associated students at Lewis and Clark. There will be, at the end of Mr. Mathiessen's talk, a question and answer period, and there will be immediately following that a reception for all of you upstairs, where Mr. Matthiessen has consented to sign as many of your books as he can. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to quell a rumor. There is no truth that the Corps of Engineers found out that Peter Matthiessen, an old and implacable foe, came to Lewiston to fish for steelhead in the Clearwater and purposefully, yesterday, raised the water 5 feet to spoil his fun. They did raise it, and they did raise it on the day he arrived. This is a difficult task for me tonight, to introduce a man who has been writing almost 40 years and in the front lines, so bear with me. Mr. Matthiessen, a native of New York, has published his first short story at the age of 24 in the Atlantic Monthly back in the early 50s. This story was written while he was still a student at Yale, and it won the Atlantic Monthly's prize for 1951. After graduating from Yale, he moved to Paris with his new wife, where he was the co-founder of the Paris Review with Harold Hume and its first fiction editor. Mr. Matthiessen published short fiction in numerous periodicals, The Atlantic, Harper's Bazaar, Paris Review, and many others. And his nonfiction has appeared in equally numerous periodicals, The New Yorker, Harper's, New York Review of Books, Newsweek, Audubon, Geo, The Nation, and so forth. Since 1954, he has published 25 books, 6 novels, the most notable of which, many of you know I know, At Play in the Fields with the Lord, recently made into a film by Hector Babenco. Bar Tortuga, a daring tour de force, and clearly a fictional masterpiece. And most recently, Killing Mr. Watson, the first volume of a trilogy that reached, I understand, over 3,000 pages in manuscript. And Mr. Matthiessen is still working on the second 2 volumes of that trilogy. 6 novels, 2 volumes of short fiction, and 16 works of nonfiction. Works which were outgrowths of either his travels to wild and unknown places in the world's 5 continents, or his involvement with injustice closer to home. The Tree Where Man Was Born, published in 1972, about his travels in Africa, was nominated for a National Book Award. And you all know The Snow Leopard, about his visits to Nepal, did win that award in 1978. A couple of other notable nonfiction volumes, The Sand Rivers, which received the John Burroughs Medal and the African Wildlife Leadership Award, and in the spirit of Crazy Horse, the chronicle of Leonard Peltier's trials, which won Mr. Matthiessen the distinction of $49 million in libel suits. Numerous other honors. Let me mention just a couple. He's been elected to the National Institute of Arts and Letters and elected as a fellow to the Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In 1985, he received the Gold Medal for Distinction in Natural History from the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. There is no questioning that Mr. Matthiessen is the finest nature writer of our times, and this has somehow confounded the ability of some to recognize that his fiction is also in America's first role. Peter Matthiessen. Please welcome.
Good evening, and thank you very much for exceedingly kind introduction. So kind that I'll never be as high in your esteem as I am right now, and I should probably leave at once. Have you all seen my formal lecture coat? Something that you said actually points to the point of, I think, the point of my talk this evening, which for me is a rather amorphous problem I've been grappling with for many years, and perhaps in question and answer something will come up that will clarify it. Can you hear me in the back? No, okay. And that's this conflict between fiction and nonfiction. In my first 5 years as a writer, I never published anything but fiction. And I still am imprinted on that idea. I'm essentially a fiction writer. But the realities of writing and publishing being what they are, I wasn't making it. I was married fairly young, divorced fairly young too, because I wanted to travel more and I wanted to do things. And I had a couple of children early, and I had to make some money. And for about 3 years, I became a commercial fisherman. And that kind of helped. But then I had to kind of turn to nonfiction. I had some success as a fiction writer, but I did publish a story when I was in college at the Atlantic, and they took another story. And on the basis of those two stories, I got an agent, Bernice Baumgarten, a very good agent too, but a very tough agent, put it mildly. And having gotten my agent, I figured, I was a very romantic and innocent youth. I knew how American publishing worked. I had my short stories were published in the Atlantic, and one got the Atlantic Prize, and now I had my agent. And the next logical step was to write the great American novel, which I proceeded to do. And I got in about 100 pages of this novel, and thought, well, gee, this is just too good to keep me sitting on here. I should send it in. So I sent it to my agent, Bernice Baumgarten, and I kind of hung around the post office like a village idiot for about 2 weeks, waiting for a response, phone calls from Hollywood, and I don't know what. Finally, a letter came from my agent's office. This is the letter I received in its entirety. Dear Peter, James Fenimore Cooper wrote this 150 years ago, only he wrote it better. Yours, Bernice. Later on, I moved to Paris, not because of Bernice particularly, and there was a short story contest in some London newspaper. It was won by a very good writer named Muriel Spark, who was then an unknown writer, as indeed we all were. But I was one of the 450 also-rans, and I got $18 or thereabouts for my story. And I thought it would be courteous, since Bernice had been bitching so much about all the postage she'd been wasting getting rejection slips all over America, you know, to send her 10% of the $18. So I fired off, and I did it sincerely. I didn't do it to be sarcastic or anything, but I did fire her off this little check, thinking she'd appreciate my courtesy, that I hadn't forgotten her or anything. The following letter came back, also in its entirety. Dear Peter, I'm awfully glad you were able to get rid of this story in Europe, as I do not think we would have had much luck with it here. Yours, Bernice. There were really no bottoms to the humiliations that young writers were subjected to in those days. So in this commercial fishing period, I decided I'd better try some non-fiction. And I did. I went over to magazine writing, and I didn't fare very well there either. I had a hot temper, and you were treated like a chattel slave by the editors, because they were handing out the money. They had the control, they had the power over you, they could make you jump, and they did, if you didn't have a big, reputation. And it was one fight after another. Finally, I did a piece for a thing called Holiday Magazine, which would be like Condé Nast Traveler today. It was the first of those kind of travel mags. And because I was running this charter fishing boat, they asked me to do a piece on boats. Just kind of a breakdown of American boats, which were good and which were bad. Well, I'm not saying this is true today, but at the time, the very worst buy in America was Chris Craft. In almost all of its models, it was an overblown, overpriced cocktail boat, which I said, not quite that rudely, but words to that effect: don't buy a Chris Craft unless you buy X and X model. And they called me up from the magazine and said, are you kidding? They said, do you read our magazine? I said, no, sir, I don't. Well, if you did, you realize that Chris Craft is our biggest advertiser, and you can't say that. And I said, well, I can't write a piece on boats and not say that. That's the truth. And they said, we're not going to publish it that way. I said, well, I'm not going to sign it unless you... Well, we hammered out this devil's pact. I needed the money, and I'd written the piece. I said, look, you publish it anywhere you want, but sign your editor's name to it. I won't have my name attached to it, but send me the money. I need the money, and that's what happened. But that was my kind of... Finally, I went to Sports Illustrated, and I offered to do a series of pieces on extinct and vanishing American wildlife, which I didn't know a little about. And I figured this was going to be a fairly easy assignment. It would take me to a lot of wildlife around the country that I wanted to see. I wanted to see the California condor. I wanted to see, various rare birds and rare creatures all around America. And I figured there has to be a book about, rare American wildlife, which I would simply get a hold of and crib from and write it up according to my own, trips and stuff. And there wasn't such a book. And I was halfway through all my notes and research before I realized there wasn't such a book. And by that time I had such a pile of notes, I said, well, heck, I'll write it myself. And that was my first nonfiction book, which I never really planned to write. During that book, an episode happened, which will illustrate better than anything I could tell you about the contempt in which writers were held, and in many quarters are still held. Why aren't you doing something sensible? When are you going to get around to real estate or dentistry or something? So I was out in Tillamook, Oregon, and I was camped on the beach there on the reservation. There was an Indian reservation there. And Tillamook, the town, was I think about 25 miles inland. I've forgotten now how much it was, but it seemed like a long way at the time. It was raining like hell, and all my books were used up. I had no more reading matter. So I thought, well, I'll drive into Tillamook and have a little gray hamburger and find a book rack and find something, which I did. There was one book rack in the whole village of Tillamook, and I found it. And it had these big silver books, letters, outstanding letters, these big historical novel type things. But it did have one very funky-looking book. There was a girl lying in bed and a guy sitting on the edge of the bed taking off his shoes, and that seemed kind of promising. And even more so, there was another man at the foot of the bed, fully clothed, in a tie like mine, like this. I said, hey, just the thing for a tent on a rainy beach evening out. So I bought up this volume, which was called Underbelly of Paris or something like that. And I drove 25 miles back to my tent, got into my bedroll, and cracked open this book, And what it actually was, very well hidden and in very small print, it was a book entitled Partisans by Peter Matthiessen. $50-mile round trip. There was no such scene in the book, but sure enough, it was my not very good second novel. That's all it was. I'd never seen this edition. I'd never been notified. They didn't ask me if they could change the title. Nothing. Amazing. So a kind of turn in my fortunes came when I went to the New Yorker magazine, and Mr. Shawn was then the new editor there. He'd only been there a couple of years. And I said, Mr. Shawn, you're writing all this stuff about Europe and the Middle East and all these places that, but no one's writing about the wilderness. Who's writing about the wilderness? And the wilderness is going down the tube. And how about sending me around the world at once? Payment in advance, And to my amazement, Shawn said yes. He had done one piece of mine, Annals of Crime, that I'd written when I was in Paris. And he just seemed to think it was a good idea. I don't know why. And I raced for the boat before he changed his mind, and went off. And that began, for me, a very happy nonfiction relationship. The New Yorker did about 6 or 7 of my books, I guess, and quite a few articles. And it kind of paid my way for many, many years. And Shawn was a wonderful, lovely man and a lovely editor as well. But the first book I did for him was about South America, the South American wilderness. And right away I began to get this restive feeling. I wasn't really happy in that nonfiction. And the book was okay. It was just straight reporting. But then I turned around and I wrote a novel about South America called At Play in the Fields of the Lord. And then I did another nonfiction book called Under the Mountain Wall, which was about a Stone Age tribe in New Guinea. And there I already was starting to fool with this kind of netherland between fiction and nonfiction. It wasn't that I didn't tell the truth, but I had to immediately make certain adjustments because everybody in the Stone Age tribe, everybody's name began with W and also had a K and an L. So you had character after kind of thing. Even I knew this wasn't going to fly. You couldn't. There was no way. I couldn't keep track of these people. So I had to kind of collapse people's names a little bit and collapse episodes to make it work. And it was also truthful. I never put an episode in there that did not happen, but I had to, for various reasons, collapse it. And I didn't kind of like doing that. It didn't seem like straight reporting, and it wasn't. But it really was kind of necessary. The interesting thing about that book was that that period, Truman Capote wrote a very, very good book indeed called In Cold Blood. And he called it, rather pretentiously, a nonfiction novel. But he did tell me one time that this book, Under the Mountain Wall, was one of the 2 or 3 books that influenced him in that so-called form. And it interests me now because it was kind of the beginning of my own ambiguity and ambivalence about these 2 forms, fiction and nonfiction. Where does one end and where does the other begin? This book called The Snow Leopard, too. Again, it's, I believe, an honest report of my experience in the Himalayas. But it also has, because of just the geographic place and the time, the sense of going against seasons and the sense of walking into the 14th century, it has a kind of a mythic quality which makes it not quite journalism either. It's another area I was in there. and in the same period, more or less, I also began to be very concerned about social issues. It's a sort of a curious thing looking back now, and I hadn't realized it for many years, but in my very first novel, which was called Race Rock, and that was my first book too, the true victim in that story is a young New England Indian guy who drowns in that book. And my first nonfiction book, which was Wildlife in America, is full of Indian material, full of data and quotations and these very eloquent letters written by Indian leaders pleading for some sort of consideration of not only of their own tribe and their own life, but also the wildlife that was being ruined so quickly and so drastically. So this has always been a kind of concern for mine. And then I was struck by Albert Camus, and he won the Nobel Prize. he said something that really pierced my heart. He said, you know, he said, in the 20th century, it is part of the writer's, or something like it, it's part of the writer's responsibility to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. In other words, who have no voice. Thomas Mann, in the same period, said almost exactly the same thing, and I think it's absolutely true. I think the days when a writer can simply go to his ivory tower and write his little artistic thing, no matter how beautiful, I think it really, and perhaps are over for the time being. There's too much that needs taking care of. There's too much desperation in the environment and in social inequity and injustice. I don't have to spell out all these things. We know about them every day. And we really can't count on the fact that President Bush is going to take care of them, is he? So I got into all of these series of books. The first one actually was about Cesar Chavez and the grape strike and the people, the migrant people in California. Then there were a couple of books about Indian problems. Then one about the traditional fishermen in my own community where I live. And I worked for 3 years as a commercial fisherman, so I knew these guys' life and I worked with them. And they're being pushed off the map, like almost all traditional groups in our country. They are. And this isn't just the Indian people or just the whatever ethnic group it may be here and there. It's some of the white groups too who are traditional, who've been there for a long time, who don't fit with our idea of progress or how American life should be lived. If you don't fit, you're out. I think this is very useful to remember. When, this case of Leonard Peltier that you mentioned, that book was called In the Spirit of Crazy Horse. You know, Leonard's doing 17 years now for a killing that he didn't do. And he got in the way. But it doesn't have to be an Indian guy. It could be any one of you. So and it's like Salman Rushdie or somebody. He's a guy living in England, and what he did involved the Muslim world. But if we permit Rushdie to be threatened and come to our country as he did the other day and have to be surrounded by SWAT teams and so forth, just because some old man in Iran says, you know, fatwa, or whatever that word is. You know, this is, anyway, we have to think about that. I should say that when we come to question and answer, now I will get there eventually, I don't know how long I'm supposed to talk. About, well, I have to show some mercy here. Anyway, I tend to wander, so I'll get back into my notes here. The trouble with writing about social justice or the environment or any cause thing is that, generally speaking, is not very good writing. If you've got an agenda, you have a point you want to make before you start, and the writing is manipulated and arranged around that point and so forth, generally it's, the work can't live by itself. It loses its own organic life. And I found that out to my cost, I mean, here and there. But not that I regret it, but In the Spirit of Crazy Horse is much too long. What it is a sort of a resource book for the legal teams that are working for Leonard now. It's very useful that way, and the media people use it. There's at least 3 movies that have been made from it without granting it much acknowledgement. It's the Bible for Redford and these people who make movies. But nonetheless, that's what it's for. That's why I wrote it, and I'm not sorry about it at all. I think one day, if Peltier gets out of prison, I would like to recast that book and boil it down and make it, because it's a wonderful story, and if it's told properly without all that padding and street rhetoric and all that stuff that is kind of necessary to make the point, but it's not good for art. And that's been a big obstacle in my nonfiction, my attitude toward nonfiction too. This is certainly true now. Also, I'm afraid of travel writing. Travel writing used to be a kind of wonderful, mysterious thing. You'd go wandering off to someplace nobody had ever been there, and you could, you know, all these new impressions. Well, now everybody can jet there on their holiday in a minute, and the tours and package things, and you can walk in and trash the place in no time. And so travel writing is kind of turning into environmental writing, which isn't bad. I mean, by itself, that's probably pretty good. That's what that really is the legitimate role for travel writing these days, I think. You know, if it doesn't do that, what's it really doing? Because you're not really discovering new places. You're discovering a new way to see those places. You're hopefully bringing a fresh eye to that place so that you illuminate others, in that way. But still, it's becoming a more and more constricted form as far as I'm concerned. The main thing, though, for me and for anybody who's interested in doing fiction is there are serious limitations in nonfiction. I don't care how well you write or how much time you put in, there are still very stringent rules and regulations if you are an honest writer. And you're really obliged to tell the truth. You can't fake it. You can't steal material. You can't make up episodes that didn't happen. You really are, I think, stuck with the truth, and that immediately constrains you. So you have to make the best with what you have. And it's like comparing a beautiful cabinet. I could be a superb cabinet maker and make the most beautiful cabinet that ever had been seen anywhere, and it'll never be a piece of wood sculpture. It won't. It's not art. It has its own form. You didn't make up that form. This is what it is. Anything manufactured like that. And so what you're involved in is research, legitimate, and not instead of inspiration, which is not as much fun. Even so, and this is interesting too, somehow among the postmodernist novelists, for example, story and plot are rather despised. The book itself and the words should be the story, and I don't know what. There's all kinds of wonderful theories. I think these theories will blow away like dry leaves before we're through, because storytelling is an ancient and wonderful tradition, and in all societies on earth, and often very valuable. And the winter tales among our Indian people are critical. They used to be considered critical. They wouldn't tell stories in the summer because those stories were so important in the wintertime to see the people through the winter, and they were cautionary and they taught you things, and a very, very important thing indeed. And I believe that in all writing, storytelling is very important, even nonfiction. The best nonfiction, the writer has some sense of story, and there's some suspense, there's some dramatic way of delivering the key point, whatever. It isn't just a series of linear facts, strung out. It's shaped and formed the way a sculpture will be. And so in that sense, it's fun, and it can be absorbing and exciting and so forth. But it's not fiction. But as I say, the line becomes more and more blurred. How would you describe, to start with, a non-fiction novel? Now, we all know what a historical novel is. And if it's an historical novel and it concerns Queen Elizabeth and Sir Walter Raleigh or something like that, it's a novel and it's also historical, and it's a historical novel. But which is it? Is it fiction or nonfiction? Well, generally it's fiction of a rather poor sort, but it's fiction all the same. And there was a little history thrown in, but it's still a very, very ambiguous form. And then you get more interesting books, like William Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner. Now, this is based on a genuine episode. There was a slave named Nat Turner who led a rebellion in Virginia in which certain people were killed and so forth, and scared the hell out of the entire South. It was a very important historical event. But there was very little known. Nat Turner, in his cell before they hung him, made a little document called the Confessions of Nat Turner, and Styron took that title. And it's a very bare, spare statement of what actually happened, but we don't really know who Nat was or what sort of man he was or anything of the kind. So Styron takes this extraordinary event and then makes up his own thing. And that's a true novel. And it's not a nonfiction novel. That's a real novel, even though it's based on nonfiction. Norman Mailer's Executioner's Song, based on Gary Gilmore here in Utah, The Killer. Very curious book. It's based ostensibly on the real facts. It's interviews with Gilmore and with Gilmore's wife and his girlfriend and his brother and mother and I don't know who else, right up to the point of his execution. It's more interesting. It's not a historical novel. It's not a nonfiction novel. Mailer called it a novel, but I think that was pretentious too. It wasn't really a novel. But it was extraordinary. It transcended, it's the truth, but it transcends the truth. It transcends the truth that you would, suppose there's a novel written about this man Weaver you have up here in the woods, or you had until the other day. You know, suppose somebody did a novel about him, and Weaver wouldn't talk, or had never talked in jail, or whatever. You know really nothing about him except here's this very angry man up there holding off the feds, and his son and his wife die, and so forth, and they kill a police officer, but nothing was known other than that. Suppose those are the only facts you knew, and you were stuck with writing a novel. Now, a historical novelist couldn't handle that. There's not enough to work with, and there's not enough you could sort of pump into it in the way of fluff. You know, you'd be stuck with going into the mind of somebody named Raymond Weaver, who was also yourself, and this for a novelist is fascinating, this idea, because even the most psychotic person is a human being. They don't know they're psychotic mostly. They have the same needs that we do. They may enjoy the sun, or a swim, or a good steak, or who knows? They may be very nice to children, and genuinely so. They may, and they may also have a terrific twist in their character that makes them unacceptable as a human being. We may have to deal with them in some way, right? But as Goethe, the great writer, Goethe, pointed out, he said, I know of no human action of which I am not capable. I think any true novelist would have to make that same admission. And if you can't make that admission, you really are not qualified to write about human beings, because we are a very complex, dangerous animal. We are. And even the nicest of us, under the right buttons are pushed, can do something pretty odd and strange and dangerous and destructive. Even the nicest of us. This was shown over and over and over again in wartime when you had people under pressure. It's amazing how they would act. So what draws a person toward, what draws me, I'll have to speak for myself, having no other body to draw from here, but what draws one toward fiction, say, rather than nonfiction? All of my short stories are based, every one without exception, because I checked this out before I made this claim, every one of them is a seed of my own experience there. There's something that I know or it happened to me as a child or I heard or something, you know. So theoretically, I could write all that material as nonfiction. I could make magazine articles out of it. Why didn't I do that? What is it about a certain situation? Then I had an extraordinary turn, which gave me a lot of insight into it. I read in a book about a man down in the Cayman Islands who was sailing a schooner under full sail down to the Mosquito Keys off Nicaragua, fishing for sea turtles. And I thought, God, I got to go on that schooner. So I went right to Mr. Shawn at the New Yorker, and I said, Mr. Shawn, there's a guy down in Nicaragua. Why don't you send me along? And he said, sure. And I went year after year because I set this thing up with this guy. He was such a pirate, you know, incredible. And the New Yorker's bill for travel was going up and up, and I was getting more and more nervous, and I didn't have anything to show for it. Finally, I went on this turtle voyage with this pirate. And I came, and some things happened, and I was so stunned and so moved by the men on this turtle boat. No life-saving equipment, no Coast Guard, no navigational aids, nothing. They couldn't swim. Everything dictated they would drown on the job. I mean, you know, and yet they'd been doing it for so long, and they were so good at it, and the equipment was so worn out and spare. Everything was worn out, even the paint on the boat, everything. I just, something about it struck me. I thought it was a truly lyrical quality it had, and its very spareness was beautiful. So I went back to New York and I said, Mr. Shawn, I'll write your nonfiction piece, but I'm going to hold out the best stuff. I'm not going to. I said, I know you're entitled to it. You paid my expenses. You own it, but I'm not going to give it to you because I'm going to do this novel, and I don't want to give it to you. And I offered to pay back all the expense money. I didn't know how I was going to do that, but I made this rash offer. I said, I will try to repay you if you don't think that's an acceptable deal. And for many, many, many magazine editors, that would not have been acceptable. They would have been just stunned at my impertinence and however they would have interpreted it. Mr. Shawn, to his everlasting credit, said without any hesitation, Mr. Matthiessen, do what's best for your work. That is a real editor. That's perhaps that was my that was the zenith of my entire career of dealing with editors and magazines and books. That was the highest moment. And when Schoen was thrown out of the New Yorker a few years ago, I wrote him a letter and reminded him of that episode and told him how grateful I was for that. But anyway, I went ahead and I did that. I did the article for him. It was an okay article. You can find it. It's back there in the New Yorker somewhere in the 1960s, but not really a good article. And I did do this book called Far Tortuga, which I think is my best book. I had a real passion about it, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I think it is. What attracted me there? Why not just settle for a good magazine piece? You know, what was it? And it's, you know, one can say, well, fiction energizes me. That's true. In fiction, I get tremendous energy. The more I work, I mean, within limits, the more I want to work. I get this tremendous high. Nonfiction drains my batteries. Even if I like it, even if I know it's good material. It just somehow, it doesn't do that. So, and I could also say fiction is more fun because you have no limit. There's nothing stopping you. You can go in any direction you want. You do it at your own risk, of course, because it may be perfectly awful. Nobody's going to read it, which is often the case. But nonetheless, you have that total freedom to go. You know, and the editor has total freedom to tell you to take it home too, and they never want to see it again. I mean, that's the risk you take, but it's still a lot more fun. Then there's also the romance of being a novelist. I'm sorry to say that this is very, very pervasive. You certainly find that if you ever teach writing. Everybody wants to be the great American novelist. Everybody wants to be a writer. Usually, if you can get by without writing, it's terrific. You know, you get more girlfriends that way. Or, you know, it's really true. There's a big romantic aura about, you know. And then the great American novel. I mean, Moby Dick, Huckleberry Finn. I mean, for God's sake, who wouldn't want to do that? So you see these people who are really notable people. I mean, big people and, you know, important and great folks trying their hand at a novel. I'm always just kind of stunned who's going to be next. The other day I was teaching at the University of Colorado. Carl Sagan, who's our leading cosmologist, announced that he was bringing out his first novel this year. Well, who's next? I mean, you know, kind of thing. Maybe Bush is going to write a novel. I don't know. But somehow it is curious. It's really true. Columnists, Tom Wicker in the New York Times wrote a novel, and Art Buchwald wrote a novel. Everybody ends up writing a novel. Why is that? It's the big shot. It's the big main chance. And somehow you feel if you haven't tried that, you haven't really risked it. Or something. I don't know what it is, but it's not true. I mean, the woods are full of terrible novels that should never have been begun. Our very best essayist in this country, and I won't name names because he's a friend of mine, he's a terrific essayist. He'll go down in our literature as our best essayist, I'm sure. And he's wasted 2/3 of his writing existence writing not bad novels, but distinctly mediocre novels. Our best critic, one of our very best and most intelligent critics, also does that. Likes to think of herself as a novelist, and she's not. She's a great critic and a great essayist, an extremely intelligent person. It's funny. Now, I've had, I say this with all the authority of failure because I've had the same charge leveled at me. Why does this guy who writes such nice nature stuff, you know, bother being a novelist? I had that review on Far Tortuga from a very well-known novelist whose name you would recognize. I consider it the most mean-spirited review I ever got, but it wasn't the only bad review that book got, nor the only bad review I've gotten from many other books. But he began a review, "I'm a great admirer of Mr. Mathiessen's nonfiction." And boy, when I read that, I know it's about to hit the fan. Oh, my heart sinks, you know. I think it's hard for people to recognize you may be, you know, qualified in both those fields. It's hard to give you credit for both, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, for me, it's always been a sort of running problem. I do think, to get back to what I was saying, I think the creation of character really is what draws you into novel writing, if you're serious, and if you're not concerned simply with publishing and making money. And if you're really interested, if you really have this terrible disease like malaria that drives you into writing in the first place. Well, a friend of mine who introduces his creative writing courses by saying, if you had any choice about it, you shouldn't be here. That's about right. That's about right. It's kind of an obsession, I think, you know. But I think it is this creation of character, and I think it's not, this is what I've been puzzling out. I think it's creation of character, but what is creation of character? It really is pursuing some thread, some deep thread about yourself that you don't understand yet. It's the discovery of some aspect of your own nature. And the reason I think that's true is because in great novels, if you read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and people like that, there's always immense self-discovery. You're constantly saying, yeah, you know, why? I never understood that before. He's writing about you. He somehow taps into the universal self, something we share in common. This is really, I think, the attraction of that kind of thing. I'm going on too long here because I wanted to read something to show you how mixed up I can get. Yeah. This book, or non-book, or would-be book about Mr. Watson. The first volume is out. It's called Killing Mr. Watson. And that comes from a phrase uttered by his wife when his neighbors blew Mr. Watson away with 33 bullets in him and probably a great many more that missed. They literally shot him to pieces, and his young wife was there, and she said, as recorded as having said, "My God, they are killing Mr. Watson." Even she called him Mr. Watson, and the whole community called him Mr. Watson with great respect, but also great affection. This happened in 1910 in southwest Florida, and when I was about 17 or 16, I was going up the West Florida coast with my father in a boat. And this is this wild coast, which is now part of the Everglades National Park. It's called 10,000 Islands. Very, very remote. Still is very remote. And he said, you know something? He told me up that river, Chatham River, there's a big white house. He'd seen it. And it belonged to a killer named Ed Watson, who was killed by his neighbors in Chokoloskee, Florida in 1910. And that little fact kind of stuck in my head. You know, it's a very dramatic thing, a very strange and terrible thing when a man is killed by his neighbors, not by the police, not by outlaws, not by some hostile group, by his neighbors. His neighbors come and kill him. You know, this doesn't happen often. It does happen. There was a guy who was killed in Tennessee about 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Neighbors all gathered around his car. He came into town. They blew him away, and they all shot, and they never ever knew who pulled the trigger. They just did a community execution because the law was either too corrupt or too stupid to deal with him, and he had them all terrified. Well, this guy, in some way, was the same. Ed Watson was killed even though the people who killed him knew that what he was being killed for had been done by somebody else. But there was just an accumulation of terror, you know, even though they liked him, his wives liked him, his children liked him. He was a terrific farmer. He probably started the sugarcane industry in Florida. But he also was the man who apparently was the man who killed Belle Starr, the outlaw woman. You know, it's kind of interesting. You read in history. You know, if you read the history of Belle Starr, or the life of Belle Starr, you know, with her pearl-handled 6 guns, and she was alleged to be Jesse James's girlfriend, which she wasn't. And you know, she was a lot of things. She was mostly a big blowhard and a phony, but she was colorful. And in the history of Belle Starr, you will read she was killed on February 3rd, 1889, by a man named Watson. And that's all you know about Watson. Doesn't it ever strike you as curious when you're reading history or a story like that? Well, whatever happened to Watson? Who was Watson? Why did he kill Belle Starr? No, a man named Watson. That's all you get. But it happens to be my Watson. And it's true, he was probably the guy who killed Belle Starr. We never had no trouble from Mr. Watson, and from what we've seen, he never caused none, not amongst his neighbors. All the trouble come to him from the outside. Ed J. Watson turned up at Halfway Creek back in '92, worked on the produce farms a while, worked in the cane. Hard worker, too. But it don't seem like he hoed cane for the money. It was more like he was getting the feel of our community. What was what and who was where. He was a strong, good-looking fella in his 30s, dark red hair, well-made, thick through the shoulders, but no fat on him. Not in them days. Close to 6 foot, carried himself well. Folks noticed him straight off, and no one fooled with him. First time you seen the man, you wanted him to like you. He was that kind. wore a broad black hat, wore denim coveralls over a frock coat with big pockets. Times he was cutting buttonwood with axe and handsaw, 2-3 cords a day. That's hard and human work, in case you ain't done it. And even them coveralls got sweated. Ed Watson never changed his outfit. He used to joke how he kept his coat on because he expected some company any day now from up north. Nobody knew where this man come from, and nobody asked him. You didn't ask a man hard questions, not in the 10,000 Islands, not in them days. Folks will tell you different today, but back then there wasn't too many in our section that wasn't kind of unpopular someplace else. With all of Florida to choose from, who else would come to these overflowed, rain-rotted islands with not enough high ground to build an outhouse, and so many skeeters plaguing you in the bad summers you thought you took the wrong turn straight to hell? Old man William Brown was cutting cane, and he listened to them men spinning on how this stranger Ed J. Watson was so friendly. And when old man William never said a word, they was bound to ask him his opinion. And he took him a slow drink of water and give a sigh. Never knew a real bad feller yet that wasn't nice and easy in his ways. A feller running his mouth all the time. I done this, and I'm fixing to do that. No need to pay that feller no attention. But a feller just taking it easy, waiting you out, you better leave that man go his own way. So Willie Brown, strong and lively little feller, he thought a lot of Mr. Watson all his life. Willie Brown said, "Well now, Papa, are you telling us this man is a bad actor?" And his daddy said, "I just feel something is all, same way I feel the damp." The men respected old man William, but there wasn't one out in the field that day that took him serious. I seen straight off that Mr. Watson was a man who meant to go someplace. I seen my chance, so I signed on to guide him down around the islands. Folks ask, would I have throwed in with Mr. Watson if I knowed about him what I know today? Well, hell, I don't know what I know today, and they don't either. With so many stories that growed up around that feller, who's to say which ones are true? I was just a kid, though I never would admit it, and what I seen were an able-bodied man, quiet and easy in his ways, who acted according to our ideas of a gentleman. And that was all we had, ideas, because we never seen one in this section, unless you would count Preacher Gatewood, who first brought the Lord to Everglade back in '88 and took him away again when he departed. So this book is full of local, regional voices like that, talking about, that was a guy called Henry Thompson, who worked as a kid for Mr. Watson. And there are other people, neighbors of all kinds, and his daughter. Everybody talks about him. And throughout, there's a voice of an historian who's simply trying to piece it all together. And he writes about Watson, of course, in a very different way. He writes, if I can remember where it was. Yeah. Yeah. 9 years after this is from a putative volume called The History of Southwest Florida, which doesn't really exist, but this is the author of The History of Southwest Florida. 9 years after Mr. Watson's death, an article in the Home and Farm published in Louisville extolling the wonderful sport fishing out of Chokoloskee was still warning its readers to avoid a very dangerous islander named Watson. The charge of multiple murders in the swamps and at Key West would be repeated many times with varying degrees of exaggeration and pure fantasy. In a day when Negroes were discounted, it is scarcely surprising that not one of the names of his alleged black victims has been recorded. On the other hand, some supposed white victims are also nameless, leading one to suspect that their numbers are exaggerated. The most lurid view of Mr. Watson is the one often perpetuated by the islanders themselves, for as Charles Dickens remarked after his visit to this country, "These Americans do love a scoundrel." Over long decades in lonely, remote islands where notable citizens have been few, Mr. Watson's venerable contemporaries and their descendants have arrived at an ornery sort of reverence for E.J. Watson, who has transcended his original role as a notorious cold-blooded killer to become a colorful folk hero, and so forth. By all accounts, Edgar Watson was a good husband and a loving father, an expert and dedicated farmer, successful businessman, and generous neighbor. Such virtues, not usually associated with notorious killers of a common type, who tend to be stunted and uninteresting in their social relations as well as in outlook and mentality, command our attention and explain why Mr. Watson is so fascinating to writers and, dare I admit this, to the undersigned. As a professional historian, I have thought myself beyond such subjectivity, yet the enigma of our subject's character grows rather than lessens with each new fact unearthed, however much the vulgar legend is deflated. How else to explain that 7 decades after his death, Ed Watson remains the most celebrated citizen the southwest coast of Florida ever produced? This happens to be true, and it's one of the things that drew me to the case. It's amazing. If you go to Ed Watson country and you talk to the old families there, they are still debating it. Was their ancestor in the group that shot him, or was their ancestor in the group that held back? And why didn't the ones who held back intervene to stop the killing? And so forth, back and forth and back and forth. Was he a killer? Was he a good man? Mainly they think he was a good man. But he did a hell of a job on him, if that was the case. So there is a sort of a walking ambiguity. So this book, this first volume, really kind of tells about the story, and it takes the case. It begins with Watson's death, and it ends with Watson's death. But you never hear it from Watson's point of view. The second volume, which I'm working on now with mixed success, is his descendants and the descendants of the people who killed him, and what happens when somebody goes out and tries to interview them, trying to find the truth. Who was Watson, and why did they kill him? Is it true that the man who pulled the trigger first was such and such, and so forth? And why was he killed for the killings which were actually done by a man named Leslie Cox, who was indeed a killer, who worked for Watson? All these things, they try to sort out. Well, that book isn't, somehow without Watson in it isn't working quite right. The third volume, which I was going to read a little bit from, but I think I'm getting kind of on here, and we want to do questions and answers, is from Watson's point of view. It's Ed Watson's curious view of his own thing. And that, for me, is the real reason I'm writing the novel, and it's the real reason I'm more interested in fiction than nonfiction. If I can get into the head of a man who apparently was a sociopathic killer, but a killer of great charm and humor. Everybody agrees he's one of the best storytellers they ever heard. And to get into that head and see how he told his own story, and see how he told his own story to himself, and then is his story the true one? That you'd have to determine too. From where do you think his mind is? So this, for me, is a fascinating puzzle, and I hope I bring it off. Thank you very much. So I'd be very happy to answer any questions if I can be of help. No questions. Yeah, I think that's so. I mean, and that was the point I was sort of driving toward. If you're stuck with the bare facts, we've all seen what people can do with facts. Look at our political candidates, so-called facts. Statistics and lists and this and that and little sort of half-truths. And those are facts, but it's not the truth. We know lying when we hear it. There's lying and lying and lying going on there. And in fiction, of course, you do arrive at a much more profound truth. You're not limited by the simple facts. There are truths that come out of instinct, out of your guts, out of everywhere, everywhere, including your brain, but everywhere else too. There's a whole truth that transcends the rest. We don't know what truth is anyway. Keats said, truth is beauty and beauty is truth and so forth. That's great if you know what beauty is and you know what truth is. But beauty is many things other than what Keats thought they were. It's only his subjective idea. It isn't only sunsets, A lot of people would find beauty in some things we might find very ugly. And they'd find the truth in a lot of things we think would be lies. So what is that? It sounds terrific. Beauty is truth and truth is beauty. But when you really, it doesn't break down too well. So the truth I'm talking about is some sense of life, some extraordinary, profound feeling, and something maybe that can't even be put in words, but that a novelist or a poet or a writer or a painter or a sculptor can arrive at. Something that transcends words. Words are very tricky things indeed, and very rarely convey the whole thing. And yet if you're writing nonfiction, you are more or less stuck with those words and that kind of rather limited truth. Did that answer your question? Your question was rather long. But, yeah, anyway, okay. I think if formally there are no constraints on fiction. You can write anything you want and call it a novel, and people have. And by that I don't mean simply trashy stuff that doesn't deserve the serious name of a novel, but also some experimental stuff which we would have a lot of difficulty recognizing as any sort of story or novel that we would know about. So I think formally, in other words, there are no limits. You can call anything a novel. You can call 6 lines a novel if you want. There's no law against stamping novel on the top of the page and saying, here it is, But my own instinct is that anything that hasn't got some element of storytelling in it, I don't care what you call it, it's not going to last very long. It's an experiment, and your fellow writers and critics of that particular persuasion will like it a lot, and may even decide this is the only kind of writing there is, but 10 years later there's another group that is saying that. And finally it gets back down to some sort of story. And by story I do not mean plot. I mean the best plot writers are movie script writers and detective novel writers and people like that. Those guys are fantastic. And I don't say that in a belittling way. They have a tremendous sense of story, and that plot just rolls on. But by itself, it's a very empty vehicle. It has to have something else. It's got to have character and some other thing. We have to care about the people involved. We don't care about the people in a detective novel. We're really in there for the story. We admire the cleverness and the quickness and the sort of balancing act. This guy keeps going, or doesn't keep going. Now and again, you see one fall off a wire. It doesn't work. But it isn't enough in good writing or in good storytelling. Story is something else. Story really concerns us all. Story is the universal story. And the great myths of, for example, the Indian people who are marvelous storytellers, very, very eloquent indeed. And those myths are all of us. We are all, and that's why they're great. It's because, you know, it's the myth of humanity. It's the struggle and the fear and the hope and all those things. And this is what really great novel writing does as well, I think. So for me, and this is a purely subjective thing, and I know many writers who would say absolutely nonsense, and how can you be so stupid to say such a thing? But for me, that is the one constraint on novel writing. That somewhere there has to be a thread, there has to be a story. Tanzania, right? Yeah. Sand Rivers is one of 2 or 3 of my books that I never could understand. But that, in other words, I know why I wrote it. I wrote it because I wanted to go to the Selous Game Reserve, and somebody had to pay my freight. And the only way I could pay my freight was to write about it. That is not the right way to go about writing a book. And I know that book, I did another one on an expedition we did. I was a diver on a white shark movie-making expedition. And I simply wanted to see white sharks underwater. So I signed on this expedition, not because I thought a great book would come out of it or something that there was any compulsion to write the book, simply because it was a very hard thing to do and you couldn't pay for it yourself. That safari we took down into that country in Sand Rivers was a very, very expensive safari. And to pay, I had to sing for my supper, and the book came out. So usually those books I take much more time on because I feel kind of guilty about them. And other people tell me, hey, I like the book, and that book won prizes and everything. For me, it is a non-book. It's never, I don't accept it as almost as one of my books. It simply didn't come from the right place. A real book, I think, comes from, it's like the piece of grit in the oyster that accumulates the pearl. It's like that. It's some kind of a funny little seed is planted in you somewhere. Or it's like the tiny little beginning of the egg in the hen's ovary. You know, if you look at a cross section of a hen, you'd see a whole little series of eggs getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right down to the big one that's going to be laid, which often that's the way it turns out for the writer. But but that's the way for me a book begins. It's some idea, something. It's like the Watson idea. My dad tells me, hey, there's a guy up there in a big white house who killed people, and his neighbors killed him. That was the beginning of the night. I didn't know back then. I didn't even know then that I was going to really be a writer. But I never forgot that story. And the curious thing was that it was an element in a very, very different novel about Florida. The whole Watson story was going to be a very minor episode. And I don't know if you've ever seen a strangler fig at work, but that's what happened to the Watson story in that book. It just it grew and grew and grew, and the Watson story finally really swallowed all the rest. I had to sort of cut away the rest of the novel because it no longer was of any importance. But that's how it began for me. It's just that kind of that funny seed. And these 2 books, Sand Rivers and Blue Meridian, began up here. They began with an idea I want to, you know, and that, and Far Tortuga the same. That idea began with a nonfiction idea. I just want to go on a boat that's under full sail going down to Nicaragua. But when I got down there, then a different kind of seed was planted.
When you begin drawing out your character, especially Watson and your trilogy in the last book, on a personal level, do you empty yourself, become receptive to the character to draw them out, or do you introspect to find that part of you, or do you just use parts of other people that you put together to create this character of Watson, especially in the last book, personally?
I think you might draw on sort of colorful things you observed in other people to a certain extent, and even ideas you had and so forth, but at some point you have to go into yourself.
You empty
Yeah, you have to let that character grow in you. You have to become that character, I think, to some degree, if he's going to be a true character that comes to life. It's sort of funny when you begin writing about a character, you know, he has no life at all. It's just a name on the page, and then he starts to take over and grow and grow and grow and grow, and really kind of dictates the book and how it's made and how it's formed and so forth. Yeah. I see that they're going to yank me out of here. What? Oh, it did?
Can we just do one more question, please? I have one over here.
There was one hand I saw up there, yeah. Hey, Bill. Somebody should ask you a question about Leonard Peltier. I think that you did not ask about Leonard.
Your notion of speaking for those who can't speak for themselves, I think, is something I admire very much in your work. And especially with regard to Leonard Peltier.
Yeah. Okay, I'll have to shout. Yeah.
Your notion of speaking for those who can't speak for themselves is something that I admire a lot. And especially with regard to Leonard Peltier, I think that takes a lot of courage to fly kind of in the face of a lot of power. What do you hear from Leonard, and what are your thoughts on his information?
This is a question about Leonard Peltier, who was the subject of a book called In the Spirit of Crazy Horse. He's a young Ojibwa Lakota Sioux Indian man who's now doing 2 consecutive life terms. He's in Leavenworth now, and he was in Marion before. I wrote the book back in 1980 because I was taken to the scene of the alleged crime in which 2 young FBI agents and a young Indian guy were killed. Nobody's proud of the fact. Nobody's boasting that the agent should have been killed or anything like that. There was a shootout, but there's no question in my mind, and I don't believe in many of even the judges' mind, that the FBI provoked that shootout, and now the FBI admits, having put this guy away for 2 consecutive life sentences, they now admit that they don't know that Leonard Peltier really killed the agents. And since he's been in jail, I have interviewed the man who did kill the agents. Some of you may have seen that interview on 60 Minutes last October. A man in a hood, a young Indian man, killed the agents in self-defense, he says, and I believe him. He certainly was the man who killed the agents. Whether he did it in self-defense or not, I don't know. But Leonard Peltier did not kill the agents. He's done 17 years so far for aiding and abetting. That's almost unique in the U.S. prison system. You can't almost find anybody who's been in that long, and it seems to be now a case of sheer vindictiveness and persecution by the U.S. Justice Department because 2 agents were killed. They screwed up the investigation. They did not find the man who did it or whatever. And even when they did, Peltier was originally indicted with 2 other young Indians, Bob Robidoux and Darrell Butler. They were tried in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, not a pro-Indian town. The foreman of the jury said, we would have acquitted these 2 men even if we had felt they had participated in the killing of the agents. And the reason they said that was because of the atmosphere of terror and persecution on Pine Ridge Reservation, which has always had a terrible atmosphere ever since Wounded Knee. In 91, and then they had a second Wounded Knee in 1973. The judges in the case have all been disturbed by the case from the very beginning. The 8th Circuit judges, one of them went on the 60 Minutes program to say he thinks that Peltier the sentence should be commuted. Even his own judges feel this man has been punished much too much, much too long. And yet our government lets him rot there. He's got everybody behind him, many religious groups. He's got Amnesty International. Mr. Gorbachev signed a book to him. He won a great peace prize in Spain. In Europe, he's very, very well known. In this country, he's hardly known. Now Robert Redford has produced this film called Incident at Oglala. There's a film called Thunderheart, which rips off Leonard's story without acknowledging that. There's supposed to be a feature film done by Oliver Stone, who actually filmed me interviewing the man who killed the agents, and that was going to be used in the film. Stone is now withdrawn from that project because Redford came in and took all the steam out of it and claimed all the glory. these big egos are clashing like dinosaurs there in Hollywood. And meanwhile, Peltier is rotting away in prison. And it really upsets me very much. I still think he's going to get out. Senator Inouye has promised, he promised 2 years ago to intervene with Bush. Now, you recall that Senator Inouye was on the Iran-Contra investigation committee. And I went to see him after I'd interviewed this man, and I told him that, I said, look, I've always known Leonard was railroaded. Now I know for a fact. I always kind of know, but now it's been proven he didn't do it. And I've talked to the man who did do it. So you really are on very solid grounds going to the president asking for a commutation. Well, and he actually had an appointment when the Gulf War came down. And now Bush, of course, wouldn't touch him with a 100-foot pole or anything like this. He's so anxious to appease the right wing. So there's no chance that anyone will intervene for Leonard before the election. After the election, I think I would assume that Clinton, if he wins, will help us. We have a tremendous accumulation of power now. There's a new hearing in October. Ramsey Clark, former Attorney General, is going to represent Leonard in this hearing and so forth. We have a lot of power, a lot of noise, but most Americans know nothing about this man. And I just want to say to you, if he stood up in my place here at this podium and talked to you for 3 minutes, you would know instantly that you were talking to an extraordinary human being, a really wonderful man, great humor, great kindness, a decent guy who had never had any record of violence whatsoever. His only record was helping his people, which he was known to have done since the age of 10 or 12. He was a very ordinary guy. He loves life, he loves women, he loves the whole thing. He's just a guy, and his whole life is being taken away from him. But the government has made a mistake, because while he's been in prison, he has grown, he's become much, much more sophisticated, much more, he's read much more, and he's a real leader of his people now, in a way he really wasn't when he went to prison. But they've created this leader, and the term Crazy Horse is used in association with him because Crazy Horse was the same kind of man. He was a humble man. He wasn't a big media attention grabber. He was a man, a real leader for his people. I didn't mean to get up on a soapbox here, but this is a case that concerns me very much, and I hope it will concern you and that you will inform yourself about it. I think it's the most important sort of socio-economic, historic case in this country since Sakhalin has that kind of significance and that kind of reverberation. So please inform yourself. By that, I don't mean buy my book. Even if you do buy my book, I don't get a nickel out of it. So I'm not shilling the book. And Leonard's Defense Committee owns half the book. And anyway, we gouged so much money out of the publishers before the book was sued and then suppressed that we'll never get paid up again. Those publishers, by the way, were the same happy folks who brought you Salman Rushdie. They don't seem to have much luck, but they... Anyway, thank you very much.